We will continue with the discussion of the future. We've heard Nick reflecting on the last couple of years and the reset, and now we will talk about the future of UK-EU relations. And I'm delighted we have John Springford, who is an associate fellow at the CER, and John and I recently published a paper looking at the cost of Brexit, updating some of the recent estimates of how much Brexit has cost the UK economy and trade. And John will briefly talk about that piece of work and update you all on what we found. We have also Peter Foster, who needs no introduction to this room. Peter has been covering Brexit for many, many years and now is a world trade editor at the Financial Times. And soon we will have also Stella Creasy, who will appear on this screen just behind me, who is a Labour MP from Walthamstow and also is leading quite a lot of work on Europe in the Labour Party. But let me start with you, John, and could you talk us through some of the things that we found in our recent piece of work?
Yes, and thank you very much for having me. I came up on the train this morning and the tracks were buckling, but I made it just in time, so I was very, very happy about that. So I'm not going to bore you with lots and lots of facts and figures, although it is a very facts and figures-y paper. But I thought if I just kind of summarise what we found and then dwell a bit more on the implications, what it means for the debate, what it means for the politics. So the headlines, and this I should say that this was pushing both of our econometric competence, this paper. This is a sophisticated gravity model which took us ages to do, but I think it's about as good as you can do. So UK, EU goods exports and imports have been hit hard, about 15% fall. This is controlling for everything else that affects trade. Services imports, and this is somewhat different to some of the other studies which have said services has been largely unaffected. Well, services imports is down about 19%. Services exports, on the other hand, are less affected, which is interesting and I think somewhat telling. They're only down about 7%, but a lot of that is financial services, travel and transport are the sectors that have been pretty badly affected. And then on the good side, the worst affected sectors are agri-food, clothes and footwear, and other kind of fairly low-value goods which have historically been imported into the UK, packaged up, and then sent on to the EU. And because of this exit from the single market and the customs union, that kind of trade is not really happening. We also have a quite novel method to try and differentiate the trade losses that we can assign to the single market versus the customs union. Customs union is very small, perhaps 1 to 2 percentage points of the overall loss of around 15, 16, which is telling and also interesting, I think. We didn't find much evidence of trade diversion apart from in those kind of re-exports, low value stuff that doesn't do that much for the British economy in any case. And broadly, these findings are in keeping with the GDP studies, which are centering on somewhere between 4 and 8% hit GDP since Brexit. So that's the kind of facts and figures. And I just wanted to draw out 5 implications, I think, from this research. The first one is that it's not possible to have a growth-enhancing trade policy for the UK without freedom of movement. And the reason I say that is because the EU's red lines have remained. We heard from the Minister earlier that it would be nice to go further and do what they're doing in SPS and in electricity trade, in other industrial goods sectors. No sign of that changing the EU's position on this, but essentially the 4 freedoms come together. I'm not sure if that's totally true, but I'm certain that freedom of movement is necessary to have further integration. And the UK's FTAs so far have been a nothing burger. We found no evidence of Brexit having raised UK non-EU trade whatsoever. apart from in these low-value re-exports. The second point is that the customs union, although the debate is slowly grinding on, but there has been a tendency to think that a customs union would help because the EU won't ask for freedom of movement in return. And the answer is it would help, but only a little bit. Our findings suggest less than the government found in 2018 in the long-term Whitehall study. The third point is that I can completely understand why the EU is insisting on home fees and a youth experience scheme. Because EU imports to the UK of their agri-food produce has been unaffected, according to our model, by Brexit. And the reason for that is that essentially the successive governments have minimised checks on food imports in order to be able to stop food price inflation from going even further through the roof. So essentially, imports of food from the EU are coming in without that many checks. We can't see an effect on trade values. And so in order to be able to get something out of this reset, the government has to offer something. And what the EU wants, what we can offer is mobility. And that reinforces the point about freedom of movement being the only way really to achieve the growth enhancing trade. Fourth point, EU trade integration in the future is a cost of Brexit. We found EU trade integration in goods and services has risen by between 3 and 5% since the UK left the EU. That is going to continue. That is foregone trade integration for the UK. So the idea that we're just in this kind of static place where the costs aren't going to continue to accumulate, I think is wrong. And then the fifth point is that imports matter. Services imports have been hit hard, goods imports too. That means that there's more scarce and more expensive products for UK consumers. And crucially, and I say this, and this is my last point, just with the CBI's remarks yesterday in mind, that business doesn't want reintegration with the EU. And I can understand that from a couple of perspectives. One is there's kind of a bit of a sunk cost fallacy going on in that we've invested in dealing with these barriers, we don't want to invest more. There's also the uncertainty argument, which I can understand. But imports, which incumbent businesses in the UK don't necessarily like because it drives up competition, are crucial for raising productivity for a small open economy like the UK. And for a country whose productivity performance has been dismal. So I just want to, this is a plea, we all think about trade as being, well, exports, because that means sales and growth, but no, imports are probably even more important. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, and I just want to pick up on another point from this report, which is about services. And one of the unusual things about services that we found in this paper is that services exports to the EU have actually declined as a result of Brexit, in our estimates. And this is quite unusual because most of the other studies suggested that services have not been that hugely affected by leaving the EU. And one reason for this is that services trade has actually done quite well since 2019. Services exports are about 30% higher than they were in 2019. What we found is actually quite a lot of that services growth has been driven by global demand. The UK is just very good at exporting the kinds of services that other countries are interested in buying from the UK because the UK has a comparative advantage in financial services, business and professional services, legal firms, accounting firms, management consultants. And we think that actually the UK would have done even better at exporting services had it stayed inside the EU. What do you think of that? Is one of the interesting results from our paper? Is it plausible?
Well, I mean, I would say yeah, no, it is plausible. I mean, one of the really difficult things, having done this cost of Brexit work for far too long now, is that, and it's always easiest when a policy intervention leads to some awful outcome which is clearly identifiable, and that's clearly what the Treasury was hoping when they forecast a recession immediately after the vote, and that's unfair. But that was sort of part of Project Fear. But what's actually happened is that we've had just a kind of slow puncture. We've just had this difficulty of led by investment, but also by diminishing trade, that has meant that our economic growth has been trimmed, perhaps by about 0.5 to 0.8 percentage points a year. And that's obviously hard to identify because you've got growth is going on. So what you're saying is that growth would have been even higher. And I think in services, that's where we've ended up differing from some of the other studies, which have tended to look at, okay, well, has UK services trade with the EU, exports to the EU done better than to the rest of the world? And comparing the two, so if UK services exports to the EU have done a bit worse, then we can say that that's because of Brexit. But you also need to include the fact that services trade within the EU has been growing quite rapidly. And if you add that on, then you end up with larger exports effects. And I think that's the point that really came through to me in the paper, is that we shouldn't think about these costs as being just that's what the costs are. EU integration is continuing, maybe not as rapidly as it was when newer member states joined in 2004, but it's still going on. And that is a cost of Brexit.
Perfect. Pete, so let me come to you now. You've been reporting on the real-world practical implications of Brexit for many, many years. Now you've switched your focus to other trade policy issues, including China's rise in the global economy and other questions, and I want to ask you about that in a second. But I just wondered, when you were listening to Minister Thomas Simmons, and when you contrast that with what we are hearing from businesses and other stakeholders, how do you think those two realities match up?
It was a real moment that Nick Thomas Simmons sat here and he said, we want a British model, right? And the ambassador of France had to stand up and say, the four freedoms of the single market are indivisible, not because we don't like it, but for competition reasons, right? And 10 years on, frankly, if you listen to Rachel Reeves's May's lecture, it wasn't much better. We are perilously close to where Theresa May was when she made that head-spinning speech that drove dear old Ivan Rogers mad in 2017. It is extraordinary that we're here, right? And so I've always covered Brexit from the kind of point of view of the mechanics of it. And this is why I think, codifying a third country relationship with the EU, that's what demented British politics, because you couldn't put the constructive ambiguity that typically governs relationships. You had to codify it into a legal space. And so, John's figures are testament to the fact that we have made ourselves marginally less competitive in EU value chains, which continue to take half of our trade. The challenge for any government, I think, is that business, Ray Newton-Smith to me yesterday in that interview we did in the Financial Times, business doesn't necessarily want to go back. So putting Humpty Dumpty back together again is complicated. That doesn't mean it might not be in the aggregate interest of the United Kingdom to go back, but actually you're going to have to fight business. You're definitely going to have to fight business if, like the Chancellor, you say things like we're going to align on chemicals, as she did in the May's lecture, and then literally 12 hours later, the Chemical Industries Association has to put out a statement explaining that alignment doesn't get you access, that without access to the database in Helsinki, we don't want EU alignment. I think the third challenge is any discussion about Swiss model, which the Commission hates, frankly, requires, as John says, free movement, an ever-increasing contribution to the budget. The French are clear, if we move into the internal electricity market, that is going to require cohesion payments. They've given us something on SBS because, frankly, we didn't put a border up, as John said. If you look at the polling, ask people, do you think Brexit's going well? No, 65-25 in favour. Ask them if they want free movement. Ask if they want to pay back into the EU budget after they want to follow EU laws. And the gap comes back very significantly, which is why politicians like Nick Johnson don't want to talk about relitigating Brexit and rejoining, and why the Commission, frankly, if you read the piece we wrote, if you listen to Maris Sefcovic or Michel Barnier, or doesn't really want to engage in a world where they negotiate with the British left, which is newly energised on rejoin, to find itself dealing with Farage. That is the bind that we find ourselves in. And I think, as we were saying in the break, it's quite likely that things get more adversarial, not less. Some of the work I do, for example, on trade policy, it was mentioned we don't have tariff on EVs. We are going to have to match EU tariffs on steel. But the more you think about, we want to align with the EU on industrial policy and trade policy, but we also want to have our cake and eat it and not align on EU trade defence measures, which are getting bigger and bigger and bigger every day. It's just not sustainable. So I was in Teesside the other day looking at a titanium dioxide plant, which was put out of business essentially by Chinese overproduction of titanium dioxide. It's a white powder that goes in everything from the paint on the walls to the paper you see in front of you. It's being bought by a Chinese company whose stated aim is to nearshore production to use the UK as a backdoor into Europe. Now, we don't have anti-dumping duties on titanium dioxide. There's a Trade Remedies Authority investigation going on. The British government, if it doesn't accept the need for titanium dioxide duties, anti-dumping duties, is going to find itself in a circumvention investigation with the Commission, which is a sort of way of saying there's actually, if you want to align, far less wiggle room than you think. And that's why I think John's the research. I'm a devotee of John's research, but nobody lives the counterfactual. So politically energising people to accept the actual trade-offs, when you've just had a minister sitting here going, we don't need to do that, we can have a British model. 10 years after the referendum just shows you, I'm afraid, how, the purgatory we're still in. Ivan was wrong. He said it was going to take 10 years to sort this out, and 10 years on, we haven't really even begun.
Thank you, Peter, for giving us a very practical insight into the realities of what is actually going on. And I think the titanium dioxide case you mentioned is very technical, it's very niche. But in many ways, it's a kind of micro-universe of trade-offs that are necessary in this context, where you have...
And by the way, citric acid, pet chemicals, petrochemicals, there's a whole swathe of those cases.
Mm. And one of the interesting things about the debate on the customs union is that most likely the European Commission would insist that the UK aligns with future trade defence measures that the EU decides, which is, of course, very, very important. In the past, those trade defence measures used to be about very technical questions of toys, overproduction China, and maybe chemicals, but today it is really about geopolitics, about how do you respond to economic coercions by China, by the United States, possibly in the future, and how much capacity do you have in your system to be able to do geopolitics ultimately. So I think that is one of the areas understated fights the customs union in practice. But before we get into more technical discussion, let me come to you, Stella, and can I just check that you can hear us okay?
Oh, yes, I heard Peter loud and clear.
Lovely. That's important. Welcome, Stella. We are delighted to have you with us. And I was just wondering, there's quite a lot of change in the Labour Party at the moment. And
Great way of putting it, Anton.
and I'm kind of wondering, you are involved in a lot of these discussions about the future of UK-EU relations. What would be your advice to the next Prime Minister on how he or she should approach the next phase of the EU reset?
A course between Peter's perennial optimism about the capacity of politicians to engage with reality and some of the challenges I think we need to accept. First of all, I think the biggest challenge we need to accept in all of this, it's that Brexit and the relationship with Europe is not the biggest issue on any incoming Prime Minister's desk. Actually, there are some big challenges about the state of this country, about priorities, about Parliament and politics itself that any new incoming Prime Minister has to deal with, that I happen to think that actually a good answer on Europe will start to solve. But the conundrum that you face is that for most of the British Parliament, this is now a niche issue. And one of the things we have to do, and actually I think, Peter, you're right, we have to get people to understand what the trade-offs are to be able to make progress. But actually, when you do that, you open up a whole series of conversations, and that's why I'm a big fan of the work that John has been doing about understanding the interactions between all this and some of the other like immigration, public services, what specialist sectors do you move into? But I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that if you're talking about the advice for any incoming Prime Minister, trying to get this issue further up the to-do list is one of the biggest challenges. Secondly, I think it is to recognise how far we have come. I am more positive than Peter that actually we have made progress in addressing just how far back we were with our relationships with Europe, and that is a foundation that can be built on. And I don't think we should underestimate that legacy from Keir Starmer and Nick. Actually, they have done a lot of work to repair what was really structural damage in our relationship with our European counterparts, and that does count for something. I think there is a disconnect between the conversations that are happening in public and the conversations that are happening more informally, shall we say, about, well, actually, would it be possible to go further faster? There is a deal on the table for the summit whenever it happens, and I presume that Nick has talked to you about. Apologies, my children's school has been closed this morning, which is why I can't join you in a hot, sweaty room in Westminster, but instead have to be in hot, sweaty rooms in Walthamstow. But there is a deal. That is going to be a very important moment in those first two criteria, because it's the first time that this generation of Labour MPs will have to deal with an actual deal with Europe that could mean something for their constituents. And there is going to be a very open political question about, do you build on that, or do you just simply bank that and say that is enough? I think there is a space to have the conversation with a new Prime Minister about building on that, not because it's about saying we want a uniquely British model, but actually saying, given some of the challenges that we are facing about enduring productivity challenges, about trade, about specialist sectors, about what we're going to do in an uncertain world, it is worth making these trade-offs. Because the honest concern that I have is that if we don't ask for enough, we will get a large bill and very little return on it. And that opens the door to Farage and, frankly, the Greens to say what a missed opportunity, or this is a sellout. I think, therefore, that calls for my final thing I'm very concerned about, which is the irony of Brexit 10 years on is that we haven't taken back control to the British Parliament at all. There is very little discussion about Europe. There's very little discussion about the consequences. We had Peter will be horrified by this, we had a Steel urgent question a week ago in which the minister didn't mention Europe at all, apart from the fact to say that they were talking to the European Commission about steel. They didn't actually talk about the fact that we were in that position because we were no longer part of the European Union and therefore facing our entire steel industry being squashed, essentially, by what was happening between America and Europe. There is a need to take back control of the debate about Europe and what those trade-offs might be to the British Parliament. That isn't just about restoring parliamentary scrutiny and the role of the European Scrutiny Committee. It is actually about a root and branch conversation with every single MP about the impact of Brexit in their communities, interacting with all those other challenges about public services, about long-term decline, about changing sectors, and what benefits it could bring within the next 18 months, not to have the kind of fantasy conversations about, well, we're just going to go back, or this is great as it is. And anybody who was at the conference yesterday where Lord Frost argued that there were no negative impacts of Brexit at all will understand what I mean about chasing unicorns. But there is an urgent need to have that conversation back again in our parliamentary democracy, because people are still relitigating the conversations of 2016 and 2019. And when you look at Europe and where Europe is now and what those challenges might be and how Europe is addressing some of those challenges, I actually think those trade-offs become a lot more attractive to people, but they don't know about them. They literally do not know what Europe has been doing for the last 10 years because they've been so focused on what has been going on in the UK for the last 10 years. So my urgent appeal to everybody in this room is to help with my colleagues to get them up to 2026, because if you want to get them into a good place by 2028, you need to bring them up to speed with how very different things are in Europe to the Europe that they were fighting about in 2019. And actually, I think the new Prime Minister will face that challenge, especially because the new Prime Minister, and it's likely to be a man who actually has been used to us having a strong relationship with Europe, will come into a very different parliamentary democracy when it comes to these matters. We literally do not talk about Europe at all anymore in the House of Commons, and that is to our detriment to understanding what those new opportunities might be. And I think that reflects why the conversation is where the conversation is at that you are so concerned about, Peter.
Stella, if I may, let me just ask you two follow-on questions, then I'll open the room for others. How useful do you think that when the new Prime Minister comes into office, he should signal to the European partners that the UK is willing to revisit its red lines? It seems to me like a great paradox that we've just recently heard the Chancellor signaling the UK is more willing to come closer to the EU single market in goods unilaterally, but at the same time the Prime Minister is still talking about not revisiting the red lines on the single market itself. Do you think that would be a useful signal he can make?
I am very clear that the red lines made very little sense in 2024. They were overly prescriptive then. They make no sense at all in a world where President Trump is using trade measures as a national security intervention. We need to be able to move on from them and start talking about mutual interest. I haven't yet heard the incoming Prime Minister talk about the red lines. I have heard all the other leadership contenders talk about them and say that that was an important part of the manifesto process. I think it would be a mistake not to use this moment to say the world has changed very rapidly in the last 18 months. We need to change mutual interest looks like. I think there is opportunity to do that. I think the conversations around defence are the first point where you can do that, because obviously what happened with the SAFE discussions is a good example of where tying ourselves up in knots about single market access caused us to be in a position of weakness in that negotiation. I do think, though, I go back to my point about, look, you need to win the argument with some of the backbenchers. And as the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe, I do a lot of work on that. And I can tell you it's actually quite hard work, because people are still thinking of the single market, of the customs union as the one they left in 2019.
And Stella, if I may, a second question. You talked about the role of Parliament and the importance of European scrutiny and how it's missing at the moment, how it needs to be beefed up in the future. And there's, of course, a really substantial piece of legislation going through Parliament on future dynamic alignment. And I think this is a really important moment, because in many ways this is the first moment since Brexit for the last 10 years that the UK will actually have a debate about the costs of ongoing alignment and how much parliamentary involvement and scrutiny that requires in practice. Are you concerned in any ways that that might create the counter effect, that British public will see that actually on quite a wide range of legislation they will have to accept European rules through the back door via secondary legislation, with Parliament having very little involvement? And what do you think that might do to the opposite argument that Brexit maybe in some ways has not been such a bad thing after all?
Well, I mean, this is why I think very clearly that piece of legislation has to reintroduce the European Scrutiny Committee. We have to be clear that there will be a parliamentary role for oversight on this legislation. Actually, I think we have been winning that argument. It's one of the things we've been doing in the Labour Movement of Europe is to lead that debate in Parliament, ironically with people like Richard Tice, because we might disagree on the outcomes, but we both agree that Parliament needs to be part of the conversation. So the previous legislation that was about European some of the tidying up legislation last year, we actually tabled an amendment to bring that got cross-party support, and we've continued those conversations because, of course, it's ironic that they have such a committee in the House of Lords, which is unelected, but we don't have that in the House of Commons. I think we had, frankly, won that argument with the previous administration. I hope that we can win that argument with the new administration, because I think it is an easy call from both left and right, from both those who want to argue that rejoin would be an easy answer and those who want to argue that everything is a Brexit betrayal, to say everything is happening behind closed doors. And we have seen that, those of us who are so long in the tooth they remember the retained EU law bill, know the damage that was done trying to rip up pieces of legislation without proper scrutiny. This government must not make that same mistake. So we have to bring back the European Scrutiny Committee process. And in fairness, that has now been part of the conversations that have been taking place in Parliament. What I can't tell you with confidence is quite when that piece of legislation will come forward. But I absolutely think there is something that, whether you are concerned about being drawn back into Europe or you think we should never have left Europe, there can be common agreement that we need Parliament to be part of that process, because they were cut out in 2024. And I genuinely believe that was a very strategic error, because it's allowed this lack of interest and lack of concern to take root.
Perfect. I mean, it strikes me, just to kind of bridge the two sessions, that there are two very different versions of the universe for the next 2 years before the next Parliament. One is the UK and the EU will be coming together around shared challenges and defence, security, other things happening in the world. The reset will continue. We will build on the momentum with some additional conversations with the European partners, which is, I'm sure, the vision that Nick would like to see. And then there is a second reality, and some of you, some of that you've talked about, Peter, which is growing divergence on China, on industrial policy, some of the differences that are emerging around these big questions in the world, some of the challenges of implementing EU legislation in UK Parliament again, and some of the reaction that might strike. So I think we are in a really interesting moment when in the next 2 to 3 years we'll see which of these two versions of the future will come to fruition. But let me open the discussion to comments, questions, any reactions that people in the room have. Lord Henning.
Yes, could I ask the panel to address the issue of red lines and cherry picking in a rather different framework than the one they've done hitherto? What we surely need to do on both sides of the channel is to stop talking about these things. There is no need to. The Labour Party manifesto is the Labour Party manifesto until the next election. It's there. You don't need to go on repeating it every single time you say something about what you want to do positively to mutual benefit, and I agree totally with the need to emphasize that. So why can't we just stop talking about it on both sides? As to the cherry picking, it's frankly puerile. Every negotiator in every organization that negotiates tries to cherry pick.
Would like to respond?
I think the challenge of this is that if you look at the last 10 years of the Brexit negotiation, of Brexit conversation in this country and in Europe, the thing that recurs over and over again is that the function of constructive ambiguity in getting agreements between parties with conflicting interests always breaks down, because the parties are never prepared to collude in the fiction that both sides are getting what they want. So in Northern Ireland, when you were trying to thread the needle of how to run an Irish sea border and not put a hard border back in Northern Ireland, that was perfectly possible to do that, except that the DUP and the parties in Northern Ireland were never going to let that happen. When Theresa May was trying to work towards her customs union single market for goods, it was never going to be able to land, because Boris Johnson wanted to become Prime Minister, and the right of the Tory party was never going to collude in the fiction that that had delivered Brexit. Right, time and again. And then on the European side, we talk about our shared mutual interest. Nick talked about, well, they've been very flexible. As you know, as a point of fact, they haven't. Right? Literally as a point of fact, on the financing mechanism of rejoining Horizon and Erasmus, on the way they've handled the SBS negotiation, there are some opt-outs, but very few. As a point of fact, this negotiation under Nick Thompson was more polite than it's been, although I'd argue Rishi Sunak did more, I think, to break the Johnson-Frost. I don't know if you heard Johnson on BGB News yesterday. The same bilge. To the point about Frost yesterday, the other side are not conceding anything. And so the challenge to Lord Hannay's point is that it would be great if we could all stop talking about it. It would be great if we could all, sort of agree not to raise these ghosts from the dead. But the ghosts are there, and the necessarily iterative, confrontational nature of negotiation means that they're not put to bed. And that's what Nick Thomas-Simmons has found, right? So when in the Labour Party manifesto, they said, we want to have movement rights for our professional artists and musicians. Guess what? The Labour Party got the same answer that Rishi Sunak had got, which is no, that's a single market competence. You need to pay to play, it's free movement. And as the French ambassador said, that's not because we hate you, it's because when we get into Coreper, all of the other governments are saying, well, why are we giving that away for free? You know, and to the same point about why are we letting them run around our trade defences? Why are we letting them, you know, crow about the fact that they've run off to Donald Trump and got a 10% deal, not a 15% deal? They crow about their AI regulation, right? Again, that's another accident waiting to happen. We regulate our AI horizontally, organically. The EU takes a different road. How long before Schrems, the data activist, or his successor comes along and goes, you know, where's your GDPR adequacy agreement? You know, do we want you to have a data localization, data adequacy agreement with us when, as that goes down the track? These things, they won't be unspoken. They won't be left to lie. At least the experience of that's what the experience of the last 10 years says to me.
Okay, Stella,
perhaps I'm more positive than Peter that there is a way forward, partly because I've directly called Šefčovič out on this and some of his team. Look, if we are prepared to move on things like freedom of movement, we open up a series of conversations. That is entirely possible. And when you talk to them, that is also where their head is at. So I think we should be more positive. I don't think it's about talking about cherry picking. It is about learning from Switzerland. Look, of course, the EU would probably prefer us to have some kind of Norway-style deal because there isn't the possibility of divergence. But there is also a model there, especially with some of the newer parts of the Swiss model that I think were negotiated with half a mind to what might be possible with the UK, that does form a basis if we are prepared to move in this country. I think the Swiss model of freedom of movement, of managed movement, is one actually. When you start talking to my colleagues about what their concerns about immigration and freedom of movement might be, you know, when you say, look, first and foremost, a certain Mr. Farage used to propose this because it was about having a job, it was about having an income, it was about having a break, that actually opens up a conversation here too. So I am less concerned than you, Peter, that it wouldn't be possible to develop a new deal if we were prepared to have that conversation, because actually when you do have that conversation with you, and that then does open up conversations about access to the single market, particularly around goods, because that's obviously a particular issue for us with some of the things that you're talking about. And I don't actually think we're talking about a longer conversation, partly because we already are negotiating elements of things like SPS and the emissions trading scheme. So there are interlocking parts here that actually, if we were prepared to move on one of them, we would get further. And I think that's a more productive conversation to be having in this country, partly because most people don't know what you mean when you talk about a Swiss-style deal on movement of people. When you do talk about that, it answers many of the questions and uncertainties that I think got us to this point in the first place.
Okay, just one factual point on the Swiss model I would just feel obliged to make is that the Swiss people will have a referendum on the Swiss model next year, and it's going to be a very, very tight referendum. Some of you will be aware, and that is very much front of the mind for the Commission officials, who have spent more than a decade renegotiating the Swiss arrangement and are now extremely concerned that if they offered additional concessions to the United Kingdom, especially when it comes to industrial goods, that would create major problems in Switzerland. And it seems to me that opening that conversation with the European Commission at this point in time is just extremely difficult. And my advice to the Prime Minister would be not to do this at this point in time, even if that is his preferred destination. But Hugo.
Yes, I wanted to say, I take all of Peter's points, and I think that it's really going to be very, very difficult to make headway unless we, apart from this discussion we had at the last panel about the security arrangement, but on economic matters, unless we go a long way forward And I take Stella's point that if we're prepared to embrace free movement, whether it's a Swiss model or a Norwegian model, we can go a long way forward. But I think that that is a completely bad dead end, because that will turn us into a rule taker at an extraordinary level, and that will give Nigel Farage a stick to beat us with every single day of the week, every week of the year, and every year of the decade. So what I'm surprised is that we've had this discussion now for, I don't know, an hour and a half or something, and no one has really mentioned rejoining the EU. I understand if we're just looking at the next 2 years, it's not going to happen. But part of the framing of this event was looking at the next 10 years. And what is not in the Overton window today could be in the Overton window in the future if some people start to take a lead on this, taking into account the very big changes in geopolitics and geoeconomics that have been spoken about. And so I wanted really to know whether there was anyone else in this room who agrees with me that we need to have a plan. It's not going to happen immediately, but we need to have a plan to get the enthusiastic support of the British people to come back to Europe as soon as is practical.
So let's do a quick show of hands. Who in this room thinks we should be now talking about a rejoin campaign? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so it's about a third.
Okay, glad to see there's a basis to build on. Contact me afterwards.
About 30% of the pro-Europeans in this room think that's a good idea right now at this point in time. Who in this room thinks that debate should not be held right now, but should be held after the next general election or in the run-up to that? Okay, so that's about half. Very interesting. Any reactions, John?
I just wanted to make just some points about timing and benefits in terms of rejoin, because I think one of the things that we do need to have to do, or at least the wonks among us need to do, is to think more about what rejoin would entail. Jean-Claude Juncker said last week, I think, that an application might be rejected, and then interestingly, EU officials, not in response, but said something different, which is the right thing, I think, which is that an application would be accepted, but that we've got no incentive to go quickly, given the fact that politics in the UK is not in consensus. So that's sort of point one. Point two is, okay, how long do the benefits take to arise from rejoin? A bit of an exchange on Blue Sky, or John Blue Sky, it's excellent, about this yesterday, and the discussion that the conclusion that we came to was that it would be like Brexit in reverse, in the sense that should an application look likely to succeed, then you will see sterling rise in value, raising the international value of UK assets. There will be some benefits there. You'll see investment rise. So there will be some sort of front-running effects. The consequences for companies, though, doing trading across borders will be more slow. I did a study a while ago looking at what happened when other countries succeeded in terms of the reduction in their trade costs. And it was rapid in the sense that it took about a decade for them to get down to the level of trade costs among the original 6 founding members of the EU, but it did take time. And that's because companies have to compete with each other. They find some margins. Oh, actually, the UK is a little bit cheaper now. These barriers have been overcome. Well, we've got this contract with these guys, but next time we'll go with a UK supplier. And so it takes quite a long time for those benefits to accrue. Whereas I think even the OBR, who had said, oh well, it's going to take 4%, their 4% guesstimate over 15 years, they over time said actually most of this is front loaded. So I think that's just the context for this is a long-term project. And in order to make it work, you need consensus.
Andrew Duff, I know a rival think tank, but Andrew Duff wrote a very good paper on what rejoin looks like for the EPC, which is worth reading. And when you read it, as often with Andrew's papers, it doesn't actually make you reach the conclusion that he wants you to reach, because you read it and you think, flipping heck, this is going to be hard going. I think it's interesting, and I totally agree with Stella that if we could move people on free movement, there was a paper floating around Whitehall looking at a super expansive working age visa scheme with the EU, which bits of the kind of political machine are trying to kind of put through the system. I think the challenge is, and this I'll be interested in Stella's view on this, she's the politician here, is about how you land the counterfactual. So you look at the Makerfield by-election, Stella's there saying, we need to get people to understand that you need to embrace free movement, it'd be good for us and we get all these benefits from the EU. What of the political discourse of the last 5 years makes you think that that's possible? I mean, I'm genuinely interested to hear the way Stella thinks that's going to happen. But economically, the benefits are the government will say we're going to bring food prices from this SPS deal down. It won't, actually. I was in a chemical factory in the Wirral the other day, brilliant, making surfactants, which you find in washing powder, etc., from non-petrochemical bases. Very clever piece of Manchester University technology, the best of British industrial engineering. The chemical factory is there in the Wirral, and they're in their third round of VC funding, and they're about to scale. They will not scale in the single market from the UK. As a member, they would have done that, and they'd have served the single market from the UK. They'll scale inside the single market. Now, anybody going past that factory, a Brexiteer will point at the factory and go, see, you said Brexit was going to screw our industry. Look at that, good Manchester tech. Look how well it's doing. A Remainer will go past and go, no, that factory should be 65% bigger than it otherwise is, right? But that's not the way people think. And therefore, no MP goes back to their, goes back to their constituency on Friday in the Wirral and has people knocking the door down and going, why isn't that factory 65% bigger than it otherwise would have been, right? And that seems to me is the political sales point here, if you want to Hugo's point, energise a discussion about rejoin, which is, as Hugo points out, fundamentally binary, because all these halfway houses, as Hugo says, ends you up in a politically completely impossible position where you're taking vast amounts of rule, you're spending loads of money, you're accepting free movement, and you have no control over it, which is, by the way, what the Treasury papers said in 2016 when it set out the options for UK outside the EU. The EEA model was entirely unsustainable, and it is politically.
Stella, question to you. Should the Labour Party be thinking about rejoin as its next
I have to inject a dose of bitter realism into this conversation for all of you, because you can't on the one hand say to me, oh no, we mustn't talk about freedom of movement with the Parliament, I wouldn't advise the Prime Minister to do that, but then in the second breath say, instead let's talk about rejoin. I mean, I would love to be in the tea room when all of you reference that. Listen, part of this is because people don't really know what you're talking about anymore. And as I said at the start, it's not on the top of their priority list, not because, Peter, they don't hear business people telling them that they're facing challenges, but Brexit is an accepted challenge now. I also don't accept that doing something now, which would essentially be a salvage operation for these jobs and these industries, rules out doing something bigger later. I do think you have to take people on a journey. We didn't get to Brexit overnight. We were on a journey for many years where the EU became the bogeyman for a number of causes within our body politic. You will not get people to understand what opportunities and what trade-offs there are, because there are, of course, going to be trade-offs. But trade-offs is part of the political process if you don't start looking at what you can do now. And I have a responsibility to the businesses in my constituency who will not be able to wait through a rejoin negotiation to be able to get the benefits of it. Because as you are all pointing out, those benefits were probably sometime in the distance. They are suffering now. It is entirely plausible that we could do a bigger, deeper trade deal if we moved on what movement of people we were prepared to accept that could have a tangible impact within the next 2 to 5 years. That makes all the difference to there being industries and factories that you are trying to save at all. And anybody who wants to see us rejoin has to have something worth rejoining in the first place. So I think I need to inject a healthy dose of reality for you all that most parliamentarians have never dealt with the EU as part of the environment they are working in. Most MPs sitting in Parliament now were elected post the Brexit referendum vote, and certainly a lot of them post us leaving the European Union. It is not part of the DNA of the things that they are dealing with in their local communities. That does not mean that they are not sympathetic to the fact that Brexit has not turned out to be the silver bullet it was promised, that they wouldn't want to rejoin. And I understand why rejoin is so seductive. But actually, we have a duty to do what we can now as part of building that bigger relationship. So I'm actually quite interested in why we think we couldn't talk to people about different models of movement of people, because actually immigration is there's probably a triple lock in British politics, which is our relationship with Europe, our discussions about immigration, and our understanding of infrastructure that is holding us back in terms of solving those productivity crises. And until we unlock all three of those things in a way that actually we can unlock, we will not make progress of any of this. And in 10 years' time, you'll be having another conference saying, why did we never talk about rejoin? Because we never did the work in between that for people to understand what it is that's on the table now and what that could lead to. And I think it would worry me if we felt we couldn't have that conversation about movement of people and what is going to move. You certainly won't get a debate about rejoin if you can't answer the question about how do you better manage people coming in and out of the country with Europe rather than being outside of it.
Okay, let's do another round of questions. Charles.
I have a question for Stella following on from her last remark. I think we all agree that the price Britain has to pay for a closer relationship, whether it's rejoining in the long term or getting closer in the short term, is softening its opposition to free movement of people. How would she assess the state of the Parliamentary Labour Party at the moment on that question? What would be the views of her colleagues in the PLP on softening on free movement?
Listen, I think it is going to be a challenge because it has become the settled ideology that immigration needs to come down. Now, I think actually we can take what's happened over the last year and say, well, look, actually we're quite good at managing immigration now, aren't we? Because we have made immigration reduce, and if you take people claiming asylum out of the numbers, actually more people are leaving this country than coming to it. So if you're concerned that you can't affect immigration, that is not the case. The question then is, what kind of immigration do you want to have? That is a conversation you can have with the British parliamentarians. You need to then pitch it in terms of, well, what does that open up? So if you are talking to manufacturers in your community, what is it about the single market? And I thought John's research is very powerful, that frankly, anybody who thinks, well, the argument we need to have now is a customs union, it doesn't touch the sides of where the real damage has been happening. It is about the single market. So actually it is worth talking about what gets us access to the single market, because that helps British businesses and it helps British jobs. I think if you couch it in that terms, that actually there is a model that we can learn from, that even our political opponents were sympathetic to, you can make progress. We cannot do conversation about rejoin as if there are only two options here, the status quo or rejoin. That is not the case. And I think Europe doesn't think that's the case either. There is willingness within Europe to have those bigger conversations if we are prepared to talk about bigger things with them. And I worry that we're not having that conversation here in the United Kingdom to our detriment, and so leaving our ministers in a double bind where they understand that immigration is still a very difficult conversation across this country for many different reasons, but we haven't made progress on what the benefits are that would come if we were to move.
Stella, if I may, just a follow-on question on this, which is, if the next Prime Minister asked you to take the charge on EU affairs, and you were sitting opposite Maro Šefčovič,
fear rises in that room.
making a case for managed free movement of people, how would you go about trying to convince him that that's something that is in the interest of the European side?
I think there is the European side, I think there's a really positive case here, because we can see what damage it has done to lose freedom of movement from a European side. And that's not just about movement of young people. That is about the movement of jobs. That is about the ability to build the supply chain. You know, people are one of our strongest resources as well. So I think actually this is a Europe of 2026. Everybody is grappling with flows of people and how do you better manage them. I don't think that's an unusual conversation. I think that's one that actually, because it also respects the fact that freedom of movement has been one of the 4 freedoms within the single market. So it's not that we are trying to cherry pick, we're trying to answer that question. I think that's actually one, I think, easier one to have with the Europeans. I mean, as ever within British politics, the mistake we always make is thinking that the easy conversation is with the Europeans and the hard one is with our country. Actually, I think on this, that is the case, because I think there is a model and there's a way of working, and it would I am more positive than you, Anton, that actually if we were to echo what has happened with Switzerland, it would be an endorsement of that model of how do you deal with a crisis that is affecting and driving authoritarian far-right politics all over the continent.
Okay. Let's do another round of questions. Do we have any? Simon.
Simon Mason. Well, I had just firstly, I mean, I think it's very interesting that freedom of movement's become, we're discussing freedom of movement. I certainly felt in 2016 that freedom of movement was probably the most important 4 freedoms of the UK economy. I'm certainly worried if we were to have freedom of movement now that we might suddenly see an exodus of British plumbers to Poland and Romania, and we may see migration going completely opposite direction. But that doesn't mean that's an argument for not doing it. But I'm just wondering I had a couple of questions about going back to John's original report. I mean, firstly, whether there was anything in your data that showed the impact of freedom of movement on the outcome over the last 10 years. And then also, I'm just interested whether in your analysis or research you came across whether there was any, what the impact of Brexit had been on the EU economy, and whether there had been, maybe there have been some Brexit benefits around, there haven't been any here maybe, but maybe there's some in Europe you could point to. Because one of the things that it does seem to me that we in the UK have spent most of the last 80 years debating British options, and so it's, so moving the narrative or moving the conversation onto reality, as Peter said, seems to be the big issue. But it seems the last time that we voted to join the European project, it was because things had got bad enough here, but things were going much better in the EU comparatively. And I sort of wonder if that is, it seems to me that is whether the EU it can get its own economy together relative to ours is going to be a big factor in the debate here. If it can become more dynamic. I'm certainly worried in our economy. We've talked about freedom of movement bit, but it seems to be the biggest impact of Brexit has been on the cost of capital. We now have a much higher cost of capital. That seems to be one of the things that's really affecting the economy. So, and I think it's a reason to be less positive about the next 10 years outside. So anyway, so that's a rather diverse series of thoughts. But anyway, but I certainly interested, John, in your thoughts on that economic side about how the EU versus has fared since Brexit.
Yeah. So just on the freedom of movement point, I did some work with Jonathan Portes where we put together more counterfactuals than nobody believes, and we ended up with not much difference. About a net 200,000 more workers in the UK as a result of Brexit, but obviously huge differences in the origin of those workers, so big drops in EU and big rises in non-EU. And the reason for that is that we have had a relatively liberal regime, which is being clamped down upon. As Stella pointed out, net migration is likely to go negative. So in terms of the freedom of movement question, I think it is important to remember that the post-pandemic episode was extraordinary and driven by some extraordinary factors. And it's, you can never tell what the next extraordinary factor will be, but but it doesn't mean that those kinds of flows are just the natural state of being unless you continuously clamp down. In terms of the EU economy and its dynamism, I mean, the thing that's been interesting about the EU economy is that France and Germany have been doing much worse than the quote-unquote periphery. Some of that is Spain's extraordinary performance. Some of it is the recovery fund. Some of it is just Poland's performance in particular is being doing particularly well in terms of the EU's growth rate. But there have also been some pretty bright spots in Northern Europe. I mean, the Dutch and the Danes have been doing pretty well too. So the big question, I think, in terms of the relative growth rates of the economy is what happens in Germany and France. And in Germany, it's looking difficult because the China shock is structural. And that means structural change in the German economy, which takes time, as we ourselves experienced in our own deindustrialization episode. And in France, you know, the really big problem is just employment growth. It has a low retirement age, which is very difficult to change. Net migration rate is lower than Germany and the UK, so we don't have more workers just coming in. So there needs to be some structural changes to France and Germany really for that to happen, for that kind of story to repeat itself in terms of the UK context.
I mean, Simon, you put your finger on the asymmetry issue, you know, which is that apart from some Dutch flowergoers, etc., you know, the impacts of Brexit are concentrated in the UK and diffused in the EU, and that, you know, obviously has an impact on the negotiation dynamic. I also, you know, there is a paradox here, which is that, you know, if the EU is doing really well, you know, and we're doing really badly, they'll be much less keen to have us. And if we're doing really well and they're doing really badly, we'll be much less keen to join. You know, and I think, you know, there is a kind of, you know, given the time span. I also think that, you know, that the UK has fewer choices than it thinks. Right? We have much less agency in a emerging G2 world to manage our positions, and you're seeing that in the trade policy. You know. And the ability of the UK to try and thread the needle, weave the middle pass, will just become harder and harder and harder. And we won't make the difficult choices because they never actually crystallise. The river is constantly flowing, and so I think the even money is not really a rejoin. It's not really, despite Stella's absolutely stellar efforts to try and get the conversation moving. It's hard to see what in the last 10 years gives you confidence that actually, Brexit didn't happen by accident, right? It came out of 30 years of post-Maastricht demonisation of the EU and the project. And I don't think British politics has fundamentally moved on. I can see why tactically on the left, rejoin is a clearer message than some of these halfway houses that, as Hugo says, has a whole load of problems. I suspect we're stuck in a never ending. We're stuck in purgatory, and we will have higher costs of capital, and we will have, marginal disadvantage that makes it, as we see from the NBER analysis, harder to convince global boardrooms to invest in the UK relative to the EU.
This is a good opportunity for me to plug in this collection of essays, and there's 15 of them, but one of them is from Peter Kellner, a leading pollster, who wrote a really good piece on how the British public opinion has changed and why regret around Brexit doesn't mean the same as support for rejoin, and he has a lot of interesting data on that, so I would recommend reading that. But any final question, John Kerr?
I worry that the last 20 minutes have been a wee bit academic. If the centre-left in Britain is not clear, and it isn't clear by except Stella's analysis, and the centre-right is violently anti-European, and the far-right is where it's always been, the European Union would respond to a British application or a hint that an application was in the mill, or in the same way that it responded to the Moroccan application in the late 70s. The King of Morocco wrote a letter saying, your treaty says any European country may apply. And the then Danish presidency went to see the king and said, "You're quite right, you read the treaty correctly, but the problem is the Straits of Gibraltar." And the king of Morocco said, "Tell me about the Straits of Dover." And it seems to me that if we were to put in an application now, it would be treated as the Moroccan application was treated. I think that we have to win our battle at home. We have to defeat those who, particularly on immigration and on Europe, tell lies. And it seems to me there's no point talking about rejoining until we have demonstrably won our battle, because then an application will be treated seriously.
I disagree with that. I think we need to take the people on a journey, and we can't take them on a journey unless we start the journey. And the sooner we start the journey, probably the sooner we're going to get to the end of the journey. You can't fatten the pig the day you want to sell it before the market opens. You've got to have a process. And what we need, and what we don't have, I think, is the plan for what that process would look like. Maybe it is the one that Stella talks about, that the intermediate step is managed migration. I doubt it, but it might be, but it could be something else. It could be this security partnership. But it certainly needs to be starting some sort of discussion in the public. It's not as if the Brexiters won that referendum on June the 23rd, 2016, coming out of the box like a jack in the box. They had been working at it for years. We've got to work at it too.
Although, as a point of fact, it is correct, is it not, to say that unless, if the UK was still 55, 45, whatever it was, the Commission, why would it engage? I mean, I'm sure that that's right. That's everything I hear is that, until you, Shevkovich said it on the record to us, until you guys are settled, what do you want us to do? Engage
But you don't,
5 years?
you don't put the beginning of the process is not to put in an application.
No.
You put in the application at the end of the process.
When you won the argument.
Yes,
Yeah.
but you don't win the argument unless you engage with the argument in the first place. It doesn't just happen miraculously.
I think we agree.
So I'm going to throw a black swan into the discussion, and that black swan is that quite a lot will actually happen within the EU itself and the European neighbourhood in the next couple of years. And in August, there's going to be a referendum in Iceland about restarting the accession talks. We'll see how that referendum plays out. It's entirely possible that Iceland will restart negotiations quite soon and will become 29th state of the EU after Montenegro quite soon. We'll see about that. We'll see how that will affect the debate about the EU in Norway, which feels increasingly alienated. And that might potentially change the dynamic in the UK in quite unexpected ways, I think, in the next couple of years. And possibly the whole debate about how to accommodate Ukraine within the EU itself, either through formal membership or some sort of more gradual integration. And it was very interesting to read the letter from Chancellor Merz to the European Council, I think a couple of weeks ago, when he suggested we should be thinking about associate membership as a step in between. And I think that is clearly not with the UK in mind, but one wonders if the EU were to formalize some of that arrangement, what would that do to the UK debate? So those are some of my black swans for the next couple of years. But before we conclude this, I just want to give one final word to the panel. John, let me maybe begin with you. Any final reflections?
I suppose just on the question of migration and its centrality to the discussion. Freedom of movement has been on the decline within the EU as wage differences between East and West have declined and unemployment differences between South and North have declined. And the EU is a lot more stable than it was now that the European Central Bank is running a more orthodox monetary policy than it did. So the next big change, I think, with freedom of movement will be Ukraine's accession, if it happens. a large country joining. So that's kind of the one point. And then the other point is just, as I said, the pandemic period had lots of one-off factors that was driving it. We've tightened immigration rules significantly. Our birth rate has been declining quite rapidly over the last 5 years. And so some of these demographic pressures are going to bite and will, I think, change some of the discussion about immigration over time.
Peter?
I don't have a huge amount to add other than, other black swans. If President Vance, if the relationship with America deteriorates further and America's relationship with the EU, NATO deteriorates further, I think it becomes, the speech that Keir Starmer made immediately after the Iran invasion was actually, from a British Prime Minister, incredibly bold speech. It was full of the usual kind of cakeism, but nonetheless, actually, he just said, this is a moment where our strategic future, like it or not, lies with Europe. Annoying and sclerotic and problematic though it is, I think one of the things, and I'd be into, if I was in Stella's chair, one of the things that would help win the arguments would be a really kind of obvious realignment vis-a-vis our relationship with the United States that would make it just much easier to make the case that our future must lie with Europe. I mean, obviously, you always have to get around our defence establishment, who are so deeply plugged in that argument always gets squashed in Whitehall. But
Stella,
yeah, if you're talking about black swans, you have to also add into that pot the election of Jordan Bardella in France, because that will also push people in this country away from Europe. There are lots of uncertainties in the next 18 months. I've likened this to getting Oasis back together, that you've got both Liam and Noel, and that was a decades-long project. The worst thing we could do, if we really want to see progress on this, is to argue in the way that my grandfather used to argue on things, which is if you disagreed with him, he'd say, I can only beg you to think further. We do need to bring people together around some new tunes if we are going to make progress on this. I think the focus for many of us needs to be about bringing that debate to Parliament and bringing Parliament back into the mix so that this again becomes part and parcel of the tools that people are thinking about how do you affect what happens in the world. Because I can only go back to my initial point that for most of my colleagues, this is now a niche conversation for them. And I think we also have to respect and recognise that Europe will keep moving itself. It's not the same Europe that we left. It will continue to develop and evolve, and that will create both opportunities and potential barriers to progress as well. We have to come up with a different conversation, because the one we've had for the last 10 years is not shifting the dial. And I'm not doing my job as somebody who wants to see things move if I don't call everybody to account who wants to see that progress, that is not what's happening with those who will make decisions on it. My final point to make is right now you are meeting, so too is the Heritage Foundation in London, with people coming from America, from the British right, to meet, to organise, to set the tone for what politics will face around the world. On the left, we have singly failed to build the case for cooperation in a number of different formats, and we are paying the price for it. So the most important thing we can do, however much we disagree, is to keep talking, because that's how ultimately Liam and Noel got back on the same stage together.
Perfect. Lovely. Thank you very, very much to every panel, Stella, Creasy, Peter St. John, Springford for joining us today, and also to Charles and Nick Thomas for every session.